Hey everybody, welcome to Let's Talk Game Design. This is the Blaster edition of Let's Talk, where 5 of the world's best indie game designers get together. We're hosted by Greg Horton, our august graphic designer and marketing expert, who's part of the Blaster team. And we're going to talk everything to do with game design. All those topics you like to hear about and that 5 dudes who write tabletop games will talk about when they get together. Things like points or no points, alternating activation systems or I go, you go systems. Just the various sort of I guess, controversial topics or topics that come up. How do you become a game designer? What do you use when you write? How do you write? These are the things that we tend to chat about together, and we thought we'd make a series out of it. So we're doing this live on Facebook for folks to chime in on, and I'll be restreaming this on my YouTube channel as part of Let's Talk going forward. I've been struggling to find a way to do Let's Talk, and this felt like a great way of doing it. And so I will give you a sort of parental advisory. Anything can happen in these shows. They are live. There might be some language that you don't normally hear on GMG, so listener and viewer discretion is advised. Hey everybody, welcome to the Let's Talk Game Design. I'm here today for one of our one-on-ones. We're going to keep doing these one-on-ones in between the big group sessions. I think the one-on-ones are going to help us to dial into 2 things. One, I'm going to try and not talk as much, and 2, getting actually like meaty and deep into like a single topic about game design. So I have invited Joe McCullough here today to talk to me about one of my most often discussed topics that's maybe the most controversial, and that's about balance in tabletop games and the importance of balance in tabletop games. And so I'm going to kick this discussion off, and we're just going to freestyle after this by just asking Joe, what do you think about the idea that games need to be balanced?
It's not where I start from. It's certainly not where I started from as a player, because I came out of a role-playing background and always viewed wargaming through a lens of role-playing. It was less about the competitive nature where people are seeking that balance and more about the story where balance is not irrelevant, but certainly of a secondary consideration. So part of my journey as a game designer has been kind of like figuring out what is important in balance, and how that relates to each of the games that I've worked on. You got a cat clawing at the door behind me. But
that's okay. So it's funny because that's not when I actually mentioned this topic to you earlier, the answer you actually gave was bleh.
Yeah.
It was a very different answer.
Yeah, true.
It's funny.
You want the raw cut? Okay.
That's fine. I'm just giving you the honest stuff here. It's funny how I think there's 2 answers to that question, and they really come from, well, what do you consider to be balanced? And for me personally, there's mechanical balance and then there's emotional balance in tabletop, in any game, actually in any experience, really. There's those 2 things. And I'll define what I think those 2 things are. Is mechanical balance is the game is equally proportionally distributing assets to both players or participants. You know what I mean? It can be more than one participant, but if you come at it with the same resources, when you start an experience, you both have the same stuff, basically, you have the same potential for an outcome. And the best example of that people listening and watching could probably think of is chess. Right. So chess is the original sort of like version of balance, where you both have the same pieces in the same distribution, in the same alignment, mirrored to each other. And then there's the argument of, well, does white have an advantage because they set the table, right? They get to go first. Although typically, actually, it's not just white. I think traditionally it's white that goes first, but usually you hold a playing piece in your hand. Yeah. And you guess, and it could be white or black that goes first. But that idea that there's mechanical balance. And then I think that we have another thing, and that's emotional balance. And emotional balance is at the end of the game, did you both feel like you had a chance of winning? Right. And so one is, I think, illusory. The other one is more grounded in fact. But I think they're both valid when it comes to like coming into the idea of like making a game, making experiences. They're both ways of doing it. I actually personally don't believe you can achieve mechanical balance in tabletop. I think that it's a white whale. I think people have been chasing it and talking about it forever. but chasing mechanical balance is like an obsession. People get so into like points and the like perfect, like the absolute perfect, like, this is worth this much. And I don't know if that's possible. Like what, like, can you think, what are some of the variable factors for mechanical balance? Like what can change the value? Like, let's say I make this cannon in a game.
Yeah.
Points. What could change that value?
Yeah, I mean, so of my games, Oathmark is by far the one where the question comes up the most. And like one of the examples when people ask me is like, I can't remember, but some of the units have like water walk, right? So they can literally walk across water, or they're amphibious or whatever. That skill is only useful if there's water on the table. So you're either paying points for this skill that has no use whatsoever, or you're probably underpaying because the table's got some good water features that you can use tactically. So already you've got a balance problem just by the mere existence of this unit, because now the value of that unit is dependent upon the table you're playing on. So unless you're going to legislate both for the figure and the table, you can never really balance that. So in theory, what you're doing is balancing, well, let's say that 1/3 of the tables have water on them. We'll make this ability cost 1/3 of what it would if every game had water on the table. But you're just guessing at what terrain people have in their miniatures, collection, unless you're dictating what scenarios are being played. So in that sense, it is literally impossible. And, when I first wrote Frostgrave, I basically dodged the question completely by essentially by almost going with a chess answer by going, look, everybody can have the same stuff. Everybody can have all the spells. Everybody can buy any of the soldiers. Here you go. So therefore, well, I didn't do it perfectly because some spells are better than others. Essentially, everybody has the same resources to draw through.
Right.
And then I doubly cheated by making it completely random. So that's the only way to achieve perfect balance, is to make the game so random that none of your choices matter whatsoever.
Just like life, total chaos.
Exactly.
Who knows what you're gonna get? That was a very Gandalf mulligan right there. It's like, I don't know, hobbits, you solve this problem.
Exactly. So perfect balance is you both roll a d20. Whoever rolls highest wins. You turn that into a war game by you both roll a d20 100 times, and whoever rolls the most highest wins. But
I mean, that is a large systems mechanical balance, right?
Yeah.
If you can keep, and that's funny because we can talk about mechanical balance in game design when we talk about making the engine simple, right? Having an opposed d20 roll is a simple engine because there are variables to it, but because the depth of the die is so wide, your variable becomes more shallow. So things like in your game in particular, things like cover modifiers. A cover modifier of -1 in a game like Warhammer has a huge impact on the game because it's a 17.5% chance of affecting a die outcome, whereas it's a 5% outcome to get a single pip of like cover basically in Frostgrave, right? A single thing. And so it's interesting to say, like, they almost have the same mechanical modifier. Well, it's +1 to your difficulty. It's +1 to your opponent's, success basically to dodge an arrow if you shoot them in Frostgrave. But if you're -1 to hit in a game like Warhammer, that's almost 4 times the value, right? All the same modifier for a thing like cover.
Yeah.
And that is a mechanical way of creating balance is you make your yes, this choice that you're making on the battlefield or this random circumstance by having cover something in the way affects the outcome, but it affects it in a way shallower way. And so it's less of a random factor for me as a game designer because I'll never know where you put the cover or where you put the models when I write the game, but I can make the impact slightly less crazy and totally off-putting to like the result of a die roll.
It's interesting that.
Sorry.
So Warhammer's actually just started to figure this out, I think, because in 9th edition you can now never modify the die more than once, or you can never get more than a +1 or a -1. So they've started to realize that this is where they were getting themselves into balance trouble by having multiple levels of possible modifiers. They just chopped it out, which is good game design, frankly.
They've also created there's always a 17.5% chance of success and failure. right? Because there's only actually 4 points of movement on a 6-sided die when a 1 always succeeds. So if you have 2, you know what I mean, points of modifier on a 6-sided die, you have drastically changed the statistical outcome. And so there, again, another one of their answers was to make the game bigger and have you roll more dice. Because in a bigger system, modifiers don't count as much because you roll more dice and more things happen. And that's okay too. I mean, but you're talking, when you're talking like really deep, crunchy game design terms, rolling 124 dice all of a sudden now has an impact actually on the other part of the game that we were just talking about, the emotional impact, where it's like, do you really want to roll 240 dice every time this acts? Do you know how not fun that is to watch? I've had Owen do that to me maybe 100 times now, and I literally fall the camera sometimes. Like I don't even want to do it. Like, he doesn't even want to do it. He's like, ugh, just rolling dice over and over.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's really fun once in a game, the massive attack, and then it's like, yeah, let's don't do that.
I have a rule, and you said this. Actually, Sean said this in our meeting last time, which is it shouldn't take longer to figure out how to fire a gun in a miniature game than to fire a gun. You shouldn't be able to you shouldn't need more dice for a result than you can actually hold in one hand. Like if you need to, like I've watched Owen's 6'5". He has a proportionally large 6'5" guy hands. And when he's struggling to pick up the pool of dice he needs to roll, like imagine an 8-year-old trying to do that. It would literally like ruin their day. Their Sunday would be ruined just by having to roll that many dice because they physically couldn't do it for like it took like half an hour to get the result of like what their orcs are doing shooting.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting because that solution, we get into that law of unintended consequences by having your game become more and more complex. And you and I have benefited from the fact that, I mean, a shared pool of resources. So in Last Days and in Frostgrave and Rangers, like you said, you always start from the same position. And then once you start making choices, you might narrow down what you have access to, right? So, and you choose your wizard school in Frostgrave, and now that's narrowed, some of your success levels all of a sudden in your spell pool. And also, if you pick an alignment in Last Days, now you've narrowed who can be in your crew by, whether they're selfish or trained or selfless. And you have a winnowing basically of options as you go forward, but you weren't lying. We do all start kind of in the same place, but as soon as we make a choice, it all leans somewhere, right? In big sort of like mass format pop culture games, like let's say War Machine or in Warhammer, you actually don't all start in the same place because once you've chosen like an army or an army book, you've narrowed your options considerably, right? You've gone from 16 to 17, 100 options probably down to maybe like 25 or 30. And there was actually a thing in Warhammer, which I'm not sure you're aware of in the last edition, in 8th edition, called Soup. Because they took the game from 7th to 8th. And there was this huge thing that came out in 7th edition Warhammer called Unbound, where you could just take whatever you want and put it together. And the idea there was, this was before they came up with the 3 ways to play that they've been pitching, which is narrative, open, and match play. Yeah. And they said, really, like, we sell toys and toy soldiers. If you have a story for why your toy soldiers should be fighting together, you should be able to play that way. And it was only like 2 or 3 pages in the rulebook in 7th edition, but people lost their minds over it. They're like, what are you talking about? Play with whatever you want. That's complete idiocy, and you've destroyed the game, and you can't do this, yada, yada. And then 8th edition came out, and they made it so that the game had these keywords, and you could go all the way back to their top keyword, and their top keyword was very like loose. It was things like Xenos or Chaos or Imperium. And you could combine things based on those keywords. And so all of a sudden, the game was unbound, but because it was unbound in this way that didn't like it still had some sort of like format to it. Everyone's like, "Oh, that's great!" Yeah. And they started making incredibly mixed up army lists that were very powerful, and you could augment all of your deficits in your army list making with the benefits of someone else's. So you had this thing that was called Imperial or Chaos Soup. And so you take like a Space Marine army or a Knight army or something that was typically didn't have a lot of infantry support and didn't have a lot of manpower. And you would just throw a company of guardsmen into it. And it became a joke. They were called the Loyal 32. It was 32 guardsmen that showed up in every Empire list to go and sit on objectives and be like, we're here. Like, what do we do? And so you you sort of like you created a knock-on problem all of a sudden by allowing too many options where people were mixing matching in ways that just benefited sort of like gaming the game design. And so I think what that was an attempt at that emotional fix where it was like, yeah, I can kind of take whatever I want now and I can build a story around these people. But it didn't end up going that way. It went into a weird consequence, which I think is
they've done a decent job with it with the new version of the Middle Earth game where you can take anything you want, but you get big bonuses basically if you take things that make sense.
Yeah.
So if your Gondorians only have fiefdom allies, they all get army bonuses, which is quite nice. I don't know how well it actually works out in practice, but it seems to encourage people to play that way.
Well, it's funny because they actually went in 8th edition. They also did another thing that was very interesting, is they went back to when we were kids from a point value point of view, where you had to take a Space Marine who was literally naked and then buy every single equipment, and that was okay when you were playing with like an army that was only 15 guys, right? Like when you're whole guys, that didn't take forever. My Space Marine army has 70 models in it now, which for a 25-year time shift is absolutely insane. If people were watching that little video I made in the studio the other day, I found one of my army lists. I found my 2nd edition 40K box and I opened it up, and there was some ruled like school paper that I'd written an army list down on, and it was like 1,000-point army list of Space Marines, of Blood Angels, of course, because I was edgy and cool. Dracula's. And it was 18 guys. It was a Terminator squad, it was a death company squad, a tactical squad, and then like a chaplain, a librarian, and a kind of captain. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever, but it was literally like no more than 20 dudes in an army, and that was like a full size. That was like a whole afternoon to play, like 1,000-point game of 40. And they went back to that 8th edition, and it was so obnoxious to make army lists. The point value crunchy. It was like, here's your guy, and now and here's the point value for his naked body, and now you have to go and add all of like, and sometimes things weren't points, and sometimes they were. So like, go and add up all the points of his gear. Here's the gear he carries, and so you had to go from like this is the naked Space Marine body sheet over to like this is the big pool of toys they can have, and then add all these numbers together for every single model in the army. And sometimes it was a 0-point upgrade, and sometimes it wasn't, and it was just obnoxious. And it also presupposed that certain things were of the same value carried by different people. So, like the efficacy of a thing like a las cannon, right, a big giant space laser, carried by a guy who can take 1 wound and die, was the same attributed point value as one bolted to a 16 wound 2+ save land raider.
Right.
And so that leads me to my next question is, what do you think about points? Because assigning a point value to something to try and attain mechanical balance is super tricky. And I'll tell you how I did it in Last Days, but only after you tell me how you did it in Frostgrave. How did you point values in Frostgrave? I'm pretty sure I know what you did, but I want to hear what I think. I'll tell you what I think you did afterwards.
Well, I mean, in Frostgrave, there's no point values, but there's costs. But in point of fact,
your gold card cost is a point value. It's a side value on the table. It's a point value. I'm sorry. I like that you named it.
In Frostgrave.
About
it. Well, because you were because there you have a central character who's hiring as opposed to you as this kind of overlord, getting assigned. But so it's interesting. One of the things I want to mention is, because it is part of this, is like in 1st edition Frostgrave, if you want to give your wizard a dagger, you had to pay 5 gold for it. And that's because I was totally locked into this thing of, you've given him an upgrade, you have to pay for it, And then, like, by the time I got to 2nd edition, I realized this upgrade is so minor and so irrelevant. Why am I charging anybody points for it? It's So in 2nd edition, it's just like, have whatever you want. It's free in terms of wizard, like, basic weapons. And then the same, I guess in Frostgrave for the soldiers, I literally just kind of, this is what a thug costs. Pick a number. He's my base. It doesn't matter what number that is. And then it's just kind of, what do I think all these guys are relative to each other? But instead of kind of trying to do a straight line, I did try to go like, whoop, like the knight is so much better. Right. I mean, he's not stat-wise, it's only that, but I wanted him way up here because I want to encourage people not to have as many knights as thugs. but it's not an attempt to balance the two versus each other. You know, two thugs are better than a knight in the game. You know, if they jump on them. So in that sense, it wasn't an attempt to balance. It was an attempt to balance.
It was influencing. It wasn't balancing. It was influencing what they would have.
Yeah. It was pushing towards a style of play.
Have you ever heard Thomas talk about Mordheim in armor and what he did with armor?
No.
So wearing armor is like extravagantly expensive in games. Yeah.
And gives you like a 6 save. Yay!
It's like a 6-up save. Yeah, it's like 50 gold. You can literally buy another body for the cost of a 6-up save, which is almost and like everything that was strength forward just ignored anyway. So it was like a completely irrelevant thing. And the idea was, from an RPG point of view, he wanted to feel like this incredibly expensive thing that you were going to buy was incredibly expensive. It was a luxury item. People didn't walk around in armor. They walked around their raggedy ass, like, like that they were, or tunics and stuff. And the idea was that it was a luxury to have this thing. And the same with a knight, right? Like, it's a luxury to have it in your army. And so you are overspending to have this little royal come and join your Frostgrave warband and go and have like adventures in the basically somebody's garbage of the city left behind after like the magical of Hurricane Katrina came through.
I think also there's the balance in the sense that it's painful to lose a knight. Sure, you can play with one, but if you lose him, the cost to replace him is going to hurt. Whereas you play with a thug, you don't care whether he does. So
and then you made thugs free even, and
exactly.
They were even more disposable. I'm sure the next time I play second edition Frostgrave with that one, he's just gonna have 10 thugs every time, and for them, and just continue to like buy magical items for his wizard until his wizard is like apotheosis again.
But that actually is an example of a true mechanical balance that also happens to work narratively. I realized, after watching people play Frostgrave a lot, the one area where the game can become really imbalanced is if one person just has more people than the other. Because the two thugs are worth more than the knight. The difference between 9 and 10, not a big deal. The difference between 7 and 10 is huge.
It's huge.
So I just made sure that, no one's ever going to have 7. You're always going to have 10, even if they're junk. So, but also it just, it makes you smile to think they're free. They just... infinite machine chunking out thugs to get in there and die.
That's it. Well, they're always willing to go and try and find some loot.
Exactly.
It's
just go to who wants to go to the city.
Almost its own need for knock-on balance now, though, because you have to be really careful with summoning spells. Because now anybody who could take you over 10 was massively increased in value, and you had to be careful with what you could summon. Because I'll be honest. The thing that's the most skewy now in Frostgrave is 10 free thugs and 2 bears, right?
2 bears.
So like Animal Companion is like this incredibly valuable spell because bears are just like more wound barbarians basically, right? They can walk around and tub thump people. And so you have to think now is should I allow that to be cast by both wizards or one wizard? And then on top of that, can they also summon zombies? And on top of that, can they also summon demons? And all of a sudden, like, it can really escalate quickly to like, I've got a 10-man warband all the time. And even if they're knights and stuff, they're okay. To someone's fighting with 16 guys, right? And maybe controlling the guys on the table. And there's this like, you get this like weird like animal master wizard all of a sudden that can just flood the table with dudes. And that can be a balancing problem all of a sudden.
The bear is a good one because there's the interesting, so you cast Animal Companion, you get to choose your Animal Companion, but there's really no reason not to take the bear. If you're playing pure stats, the bear's just better. You might want the cat or the wolf because he's faster, but generally you want the bear. And like I went around so many times on this. Do I make the bear a specialist, whereas the wolf is a standard soldier? And just like the more I did it, the more I thought like there's no fun, good way to make this choice. Like,
no, because if you make it random, then you have to worry about what's in their model collection and what they've
exactly
wizard, and and that's the slippery slope now. Is to make things mechanically balanced, we stop making the game fun and interesting because there's a certain amount of franchise you have to leave the players and choice to have it not be chess and not have it not be just these two opposed colors basically that are exactly the same and mirrored, because now you have at the core fundamental the difference between a hobby game where my creation fights your creation, and a mechanically balanced system like, let's say, chess or Go, where at the outset we have the same resources and unlimited potential, right? And that's, I think, if we're going to really dig into what is game balance, we have to talk about what is the I guess the actual desire of the player. Because I think more than us as designers, we can give them a framework. The player walking into it has to want a specific thing out of it that the game may not even be able to provide. And I think there's a great example of that when you watch me and Owen play Frostgrave. Owen is literally genetically predisposed to try and game the system. I've tried hitting him, I've tried yelling at him. I can't no amount of abuse is ever going to get this out of this kid. He reflexively does it. And that's fine. He looks for loopholes. It's how he's wired. I look for cool miniatures I can paint to put down on the table and make a selection. And it's a great, I mean, we're a great combination, I think, to have on camera and to present games to people, because we represent both sides of a coin, right? Of what people are after. But if you go into a game looking for mechanical balance and a tight sort of like rule system that allows you to make on-table decisions that have lots of meaning, but your pre-table decisions, the metagame is going to maybe influence that, but not be the whole game. Games, an RPG light game like Frostgrave or Rangers or Last Days isn't necessarily designed to provide that, right? It's designed to provide you surprise and delight when all of these random things happen on the table. And so how do you manage that expectation? Because I have read a lot of criticisms of my games and your games. They say, oh, there's better systems out there because these aren't balanced. You know what I mean? And I kind of laugh at that, because I'm like, well, yes, there are, but also you pick, like, you got into the fun bus when you're expecting a race car. And it's like, oh, this fun bus doesn't handle like a race car. And you're like, well, did you look at the paint before you got in? Like, did you know what you were doing? And I kind of wonder, how do you feel about that?
So I started dealing with that by crying a lot, huddled in a corner. And like I can actually remember, like, there was a point about a year after Frostgrave came out where, for whatever reason, there was this big influx of players. And a lot of those, I think, had come over from Warhammer or War Machine or something, that style of game. And I just got flooded with these questions that were like, just really rules, detail, intricate. And it for a while, it just kind of overwhelmed me. And I was like, God, I don't know what's going on here. And then I realized, like, because I didn't realize at first, like, none of these situations had actually occurred during a game. These were completely theoretical things that people had just pieced together in their minds by reading the rules. And which was good to hear, because at first I thought, oh my God, I've made all these mistakes by not telling people what happens in these situations, when in fact, actually I made the right decision, because if I had, the rule book would have been 3 times the length, and the chance of these situations arriving is so minuscule that it's better to just not discuss it and answer the question should it ever come up. But I think what tends to happen, though, is those people come to Frostgrave, check it out, and very quickly realize it's just not for them. That's not the style of game they're looking for. And thankfully, after Frostgrave got popular enough, I got to a place where I was comfortable enough where I could actually say that to people. Like, I just don't think this is the type of game you want to play. You want something that's much more, competitive, really thought out, army list building, generating. This probably isn't the game for you. And I think one of the secrets of the success of Frostgrave is it came out at a time where that style of game, that kind of RPG, let's just have fun game, was not overly common in wargaming. It's where so many of us started with, like, Rogue Trader, and back in the days when so much of the hobby you had to build yourself anyway, that you just were experienced in building it, and that's where you approached it from. But over years of corporations coming in, and
anymore. That's not necessarily the audience anymore. It's funny because we identify with those people, and
it's not in terms of, if you take the entirety of wargaming, because the entirety of wargaming is mostly 40K and X-Wing players.
Yeah, and who've only discovered maybe in the last 10 years what wargaming is, and so they have a very different lineage and picture of what wargaming is. Because I have a whole other discussion, I think, that we could have about this, where people who grew up on pen and paper RPGs and doing it all yourself have a really different expectation from kids that grew up on video games, where there isn't this pre-work that goes into enjoying something, and you want a more sort of like bottled experience that comes to you ready to go. And that's why I think that's why X-Wing did so well, is you had this like ready to play out of the box, like you just punched tokens and played, versus you and I making, grab tank out of deodorant tubes and
deodorant bottle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That level of difference.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that like one of these is better than the other. I'm just saying that this is where I come from, and thus that is what I enjoy, and thus that is what I am as a game designer. And the hobby is big enough that there are enough people like me, or similar in that kind of, this is what makes the game fun to me, that I can write games for them and do that professionally, and gotten to the point where I'm not bothered by the people I'm not reaching, because I'm not trying to reach them. If they want to experiment with that type of gaming, great, they're welcome to do so. But if they they want the completely out of the box package, then my games aren't going to be the ones.
Well, I think what's cool is that makes us a little punk rock now, Joe. People haven't experienced that stuff before and are discovering it for the first time. And I do think a big part of that renaissance in things like solo gaming and in cooperative gaming is coming out of the fact that it's something that isn't offered by the mass market, right? And so if you've only discovered wargaming 10 years ago, you go, what? I can play and not try and win against the other person? Or like, I can play this game by myself? Like, what are you talking about? This isn't. And then for some people, that just switches the light on. Because I think you're right. I don't think it's necessarily a right or wrong thing. I think it's, if you've only ever done this one thing this one way, if you've only ever had an experience handed to you by video games or by, whatever your previous hobbies are, then to all of a sudden be challenged by it a little bit and have to do it yourself. Some people just really rise to that and go, this is what I was missing. Like, I liked playing video games, but I'm the guy that made my own Fallout levels. I'm the guy who played Super Mario Maker and made Super Mario levels like forever. I'm the guy that game was for. And now I want to jump into this, and this is a really an enriching and sort of like fulfilling experience all of a sudden. And so I think it's funny, because I think we come full circle, right? Where what we're doing now, well, you and I would have been everywhere in the 90s, is far less common. And so by virtue of being what people don't sort of like expect and what people don't see, it becomes this kind of like outlier, indie, edgy way of enjoying it. And I see people, it's funny because I see people who are, sort of these like bigger names in maybe the online community, they're really talented painters, or they're really talented, like, presenters or whatever, discover a little indie game for the first time and go, I love this. Like, this is really, really not what I was expecting. And so I think there's some value there, because by virtue of not being a mechanically balanced, oriented game designer, you are now reaching people in a different way that they haven't experienced before, and that has value. And I think we've seen that in Frostgrave. There was a gap in the market for an adventure game that Frostgrave just hit at the right time. I mean, where that void was there, and
yeah. I mean, in retrospect, it looks like, oh, brilliant, putting out the game just then, and it's like, that just had nothing to do with it. There's no right. I'm not aiming for this hole. I was also really lucky.
Thanks for the marketing credit, but
yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, like the second two.
Frostgrave came out like the month after Games Workshop destroyed the old world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, total coincidence, but it's like so many people in the hobby just went, I'm looking for something else, because they were just so unhappy. And, that was a huge boon. Here is literally something else. It's a totally different style of play, but it's still got monsters and wizards. So, why don't you try this? But yeah, so really by sitting in place long enough, I became cutting edge, right?
That's exactly it. If you sit by the river long enough, the bodies of your enemies will float by.
Exactly. Oh, there we go.
Sit long enough by the river and the bodies of the enemies will float by. I think that's a really valuable thing to talk about too. Maybe in another episode is just like, is why do you make your game? If you make your game thinking that it's going to be this like innovative flash in the pan or like innovative like Herculean thing, it's going to rise up and destroy other games. You've probably ignored the fact that there's so many games out there and it's random chaos, and there's a lot of like luck and presentation and hard work involved in the going to
so much luck. Yeah.
A whole lot of luck, exactly. So we've talked a bit about we've talked a lot about mechanical balance and things like assigning point values. We talked a lot about just like that trap that you can get into of trying to make things balanced. I actually don't think I've given my 2 cents on that. I actually don't believe very much in point values. I think they should be a rough guesstimate, and they should make somebody. They should have 2 things involved. One, they should present the players with a way of feeling like they both had the equal resources before they put the models on the table. So for you, it's a gold crown limit when you first hire your warband, which you topped up for free with basic models, which I thought was genius. Ghost Archipelago. For me, it's about having not just that feeling of like sort of balance when you first put your crew down, but also it needs to be mechanically easy to do.
This cat is getting in. So.
The cat's getting in. All right, sweet. The cat's here. Which cat's name?
Tigger.
Tigger. All right, hey, Tigger.
Clawing at the door until he gets in.
That's fine. It has to be easy to do too, because I think that you reach a point where you actually put people off with too much detail. So I like flat round point values. And it's funny to give you the differential. I loved the point value system they added to Warhammer Age of Sigmar, where nothing was by 5s. It was all at most by 10s. It was relatively flat. And I hated the 8th edition 40k one where you might spend 1 point on something 3 times in the army. And like, it could even make it impossible to spend your last like 14 or 15 points to the point where like, it was just frustrating. Right. Army list. So my personal sort of like, I guess, stance is if you're going to evaluate something by point values, ignore what its offensive potential is for the most part and focus on its presence on the table. How long does it take to die? And that's the thing that I would assign point values to, which means for me, I think it's more valuable to assign a value to the Space Marine's body than to his guns. Right. Because his guns are affected by chance, right? So when I'm assigning point values, I look at a guy and I go, if I roll a die, if I spend this many points on a gun and it never hits the entire game, I didn't get my value out of it. So as a game designer, right. I don't care about the value of that piece of equipment as much as I care about how many times can this guy get shot by a gun, because that never changes, right? There are some dice involved in how long he stays, but if he's got a toughness and wounds, that affects every dice roll, and that affects every time he takes a point of damage and doesn't die. And so for me, just assigning a rough point value to how long I can stand on the table so that if my opponent and I are playing a game, we have the rough same amount of hit points when we first put models down is the most important thing to me. Because typically every tabletop game involves either moving between point A and point B and not dying, or standing on point A or point B and not dying. And that means that the meat is the most valuable part in the game, because it's always there. It's fulfilling its objective regardless of any dice rolls until it runs out of whatever juice is that keeps it going, hit point structure, whatever that's going to be. And once I made that leap of logic, that presence on the table is the thing that wins a game typically, and that how long you can stay on the table is more important than how your ability to take things off the table is. And when that gets really extreme, you can start to consider it. But for the most part, everybody has like kind of a mediocre ability to remove pieces in comparison to their staying on the table. Then to me, that's where you start assigning point values. And if you really want to dig into those big, chunky, flat point values. And so that's my thing about points is keep them simple, keep them easy to add up, and focus more on the survivability and displacement of the things on the game than you do on the like nitty gritty of has this guy washed his socks and should that be worth points or something like that.
It's funny, like as a player, I love point values because point values are part of the fun in that So like right now, I'm building a Warhammer 4th edition, 40K 4th edition Lost in the Damned Army. Not because I particularly play Warhammer 4th edition, though I would happily, but because
the next time you and I go to Adepticon, we'll play a game of 4th edition 40K.
Right.
I'll get period models. I'll do the whole thing. That'll be perfect. When we can actually get together again, we'll play a 4th edition game of 40K. I'd be so down for that.
But I like the structure it provides. So I've got my Eye of Terror book, and it's got the army list for Lost in the Dam, and it's just like, here's a bunch of units, here's what you can have, here's what they cost. So I can just go, all right, I want this army. This just gives me some idea for what I can do, and the points kind of tell me like how big it will be. So I can say, all right, I'm just gonna make a 2,000 point army. Let's see what I can get, So that's great. But of course that to me again really has nothing to do with balance in the sense that I'm not even trying to make a good army. I'm just trying to make
a good check plan army list, and that's letting you plan your painting.
Exactly.
Like that check plan. That's facilitating your hobby time more than it's facilitating doing the table.
Right. So in that, points are really valuable as part of the hobby experience. As a game designer, they're just absolutely awful, and because deep down you can't get it right because it's a question that doesn't have a right answer. I mean, in Oathmark, where it's the biggest thing for my games, the point values are more than anything based on what is the chance that this unit's actually going to do what you want it to,
right?
And that's
you went the other
big
way,
modifier.
Offensive skew into points, so it's less about its presence, but its ability to do damage.
Yeah, it's more about its ability to just do anything at all, which damage is the main thing that something can do, but also seize objectives, and so it has a bit of that presence as well, because if you can't get it to go where it needs to be on the table, but I mean, how do you really balance that? Here's a unit that fights slightly better but is less likely to actually move than the unit that doesn't fight as well but will move, and I came up with a system, but
player using it wrong. That's the biggest thing that game designers can't balance is if you take a tank and cover it in guns and give it 1,000 points of armor, but then have your player sit with it in a corner facing the wrong direction, is it worth its point value anymore? It just isn't.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's points are so subject to the actual player and the topography of the battlefield and the mission you're trying to accomplish and whether there's a river, you know what I mean? Like getting it right is literally impossible. It is a mechanical impossibility because you need a perfect computer using it perfectly every time to actually have it cost the value that you've assigned to it in your head. Right. And they have to be playing it the way you thought that it should be played too, for the value that you assign to be right. So they literally have to be you. You know what I mean? To be able to give it to have the points to be balanced.
Yep. And I mean, even if you play test something 1,000,000 times, there's still going to be situations that never came up, or somebody uses something in a way you just never imagined that, actually probably makes it worth a bit more than you realized. But
Owen with wall.
Yeah. Owen with anything.
Unlimited walls. I don't mind if I do.
Owen is a great example of someone who I would have expected to stop playing Frostgrave by now.
Yeah, that was literally the first spell that he looked at when he opened the second edition book. He's like, "Can I make unlimited walls still?" And he's like, "Yeah, Frostgrave. I'm just gonna do this." And I'm like, "Owen, stop. Just stop. Don't take wall. You're done." It's funny because think about the value that he got out of a non-offensive spell that allowed him to control the thing that you and I as game designers can't control, which is the battlefield. Because that inherently devalued all of my shooting, all of my spells, all of my guys who have to walk over to hit somebody by just putting a wall in front of them. And that the power of being able to change the battlefield was massive. And of course, Owen's brain being Owen's brain, he just went and said, "Well, what can you not stop? You can't hurt the wall. You can't do anything to the wall. Unlimited walls, and we're gonna go to Wall Town." And this is the thing I do now. I'm wall guy. And as a game designer, you couldn't have known that someone was gonna take that and run all the way to the end of the track with it. You know what I mean? Like I mean, you do now, and in 3rd edition Frostgrave, if each wizard can maintain more than one wall, I'm going to come burn your house down. But that's just, that's beside the point.
Yeah, I mean, like,
wizard control one wall, and that's it, and they have a damage, and I can hit them and knock them down. That's my one. I'm going to design this part of Frostgrave 3rd edition, just so you know.
Like when I wrote Perilous Dark and was talking about dungeon setups, I had to actually change the rules for wall because I realized if you can just put a wall, game's over. You can no longer come on this side of the table. But the problem is, like, as you were saying, I don't know when you sit down to play Frostgrave how much your table looks like a dungeon. Yeah. Because obviously I say crowd the table with terrain, but if you take that to the absolute literal, then wall becomes this unstoppable spell.
Yeah. And for someone where Owen just goes, nope, I'm not going to fight you today. And
exactly. All the treasures are on my side.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think that's the perilous dark of game design, right? Is we don't know what people are going to do with what we make. And you can make the most powerful thing on earth, but if someone uses it wrong, it's not actually worth what it's worth. And you have, and the problem with game design and balance is that and this is to me the most important thing with emotional balance, is negative gameplay experiences should be avoided at all costs. And if you look at like FAQs and rewrites to games, they typically, if it has to happen between editions, they typically, if the company is smart, ignore the things that are just minutia. Like if it's an errata, you print something wrong in a rulebook, great, fix it. But really focus on the things that make the outcome not fun for one of the two people. Because that is what balance to me at the core is really about. Balance is about not the reality of mechanical balance, but about the illusion that the game was fair and we both walk away having enjoyed the result. Because otherwise, why do we play games? Yeah. Right? Yes, some people play games to crush their enemies, see them driven before them, and hear the lamentations of the women. But those people don't get to play a lot. And right now in COVID, they're not playing at all because they have to pay people to play them by going to tournaments. That's a whole other thing about.
I mean, that's where we have this huge advantage writing narrative games.
Yeah.
Because the whole concept of winning and losing is secondary, or it's not even there.
Well, we define winning isn't just like the tactical I killed everyone on the table. It's we define what that is story wise and mechanically.
Yep. And like with Frostgrave, if you get one treasure off, you might be thinking, yeah, got me a treasure, like my warband is slightly better than it was before, I mean, this is, I think, one of the problems I had playing Mordheim was it was too easy to just get stomped and like feel like I didn't get anything out of that battle. In fact, I am noticeably worse now after that than I was before. And that could happen in Frostgrave in 1st edition, but it wasn't very common. And that's one of the reasons like thugs became free.
I think you even said in 1st edition, you said, I guess the person that wins is the person that gets the most treasure, but yeah. I'm like, and Owen hated that part. He's like, is there not a way to win? And I'm like, well, no, because we're just going to have another adventure after this. And he's like, I don't understand. This does not compute. So Steve's ready to come out.
The best part of that is it wasn't even in the manuscript. Phil made me put that in.
I know,
Not that specifically, but he made me say, you got to have some sort of victory condition in here. I was like, okay, fine. I had just written it.
Victory is the
never even thought to mention it. Getting stuff is winning. You get some stuff, you win.
I mean, well, it's funny because it's funny, 2nd edition also made the central treasure, which was something that didn't exist before. Because you could just put both players, there was an even number of treasures, and both players just put them evenly distributed along their starting deployment zone. And the treasures didn't have there was no treasure with attention because you relied on the player. You assume the players were going to stick them in the middle of the table, and they never did. Ever.
Yeah, that was a big mistake.
9 inches away from my thief, and he goes whoop whoop and just walks.
Yeah, you do occasionally, like as a game designer, you think you need to put this rule in. Oh, and make sure it's fun. Set up the treasures somewhere where it's gonna be fun. Because I spent a lot of time like explaining rules for setting up treasure in 2nd edition to make sure that like if you're literally following the rules, it now works better. But really, I just want to say like put them in hard to get to places so it's fun to fight over them.
Exactly. Well, and that's that whole rules as intended versus rules as written
Yeah.
problem, right? And I am a rules as intended guy. I will, if I don't understand a rule, I will try to understand how this game is written and what they probably mean to achieve the feeling of this result. Owen is literally going to words and do the thing and then go, well, this is stupid when it doesn't.
Page 53.
It's funny because Owen will get more mad at a game if he wins too easily. That is
really?
If I can get Owen hooked on a game, I have to absolutely obliterate him in the first couple games, because if I don't, if he wins in the first couple games too, he's like, I got to figure it out. I'm done. I'm out. And he just leaves.
Right.
He's totally not interested in something if he grasps it too easily. And it's funny because he's really enjoying BattleTech because I beat the pants off him a couple times. And at the first couple games we played, he's playing with the Omnimex, and we were still messing around with dice and stuff like that, and he did really well. Yeah. But the last like 3 or 4 games I played against him now, I've kind of dialed in like what I want my army to be, and he's like, he's not really digging into the rule books. He's just picking powerful pieces and thinking that he can just do whatever he wants with them. And we also didn't get the whole era system, so he was just playing with the most powerful Omnimex, like all stuff.
All right.
And like now that we have to pick an era, like, and it's become more balanced, and he's had to actually take it, like he's interested because he's trying to figure out, oh, the most powerful piece isn't necessarily the best because it gets activated a whole bunch and it can't hit anything because its skill value is so low. And like that need to like dig into it and give him some more challenge is actually the thing that like draws him forward. But as soon as like if a rule is written doesn't make sense to him, he'll just throw his hands in the air and be like totally just done.
I mean, he approaches, all games are logic puzzles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
which is fun. If what you like is solving logic puzzles, great. But
combing the rules too for loopholes. Like there's a type of game that enjoys like an absolute critical like look at a rule system to try and figure out what the either the designer or the other player won't have thought of to try and achieve victory, right? To look for the advantage. And that's okay. I mean, that's completely legitimate type of gameplay. I don't get that wrong. But again,
in fact, you want to recruit those as your playtesters.
If you got on the fun bus, don't expect a Bugatti, right? 2 different things.
Like you say, you want those guys as playtesters, and then you never want to see them again after the game.
And then you put them back in their.
Exactly.
It's funny. That's exactly what I use Owen for. I just put them back in.
Exactly.
I give him some Lego robots, and we play Lego robots for a while, and then I put him back in his box. I don't want to touch my stuff anymore. So we've gotten to a whole bunch of topics now about the idea of balance. I guess what I want to say, just to kind of wrap this up and tie it off, is if you could go back now and you wanted to tell Joe, who wrote first edition Frostgrave, 3 things. I'm gonna let you mow on 3 things that you think are important to writing a balanced game, or are important to trying to make your game as appealing to as many people as possible, right? Because you are trying to capture both the people that are looking for a fun, enjoyable experience and the people who want a bit of a challenge. I should say we should never try and write someone out of your game system. I don't think that's a good thing to do. Gatekeeping. What are 3 things you would tell 2011 or 2012 Joe about game design and balance that you think are important? And they can be super simple, like top end things.
Okay. I mean, first, I'd have to be really careful because I do think that the rawness of Frostgrave First Edition was part of its appeal. Because it was written in a much more writerly way, I think, than most war games are, because I came out of writing fiction, and so a lot of people found the game a lot more accessible because of that. But that language also made it less effective sometimes as a rule set. Like one thing I would say, like, is
what you're saying. Could have been both. Yeah.
Never use the word may. Like that's one that just killed me, because like, may, huh? That means I don't have to.
Yep.
That's just me trying to be polite when what I mean is must. All right, you must do this most of the time anyway. So
it's funny because we have talked about that. Is that there is from a balance point of view, there is an accessibility thing where you still want to be digestible when you're writing rules. And I liked your process driven way of writing Frostgrave, but I think I've talked to you about this before, where you wrote it in the order you do things before you play a game. right?
Yeah.
Where it's you make your wizard, you hire his people, you set up the battlefield and the stuff on the battlefield, and then here's how you walk around and do those things, and then here's 10 different stories that you can do while you do those things. And so it was process written so that people were absorbing the rules in a way that was the order they would have to do things physically themselves, going and leading up to getting to the table. And I think that's a really valuable thing, is that don't get caught up on writing a technical document, because that's not fun to read. It actually makes it hard to digest something.
Yeah, it does. Like I was saying about that, that's why you don't want to give a ruling for literally everything that can happen. A, it's impossible. B, you'll just have this weighty tome that no one's going to want to read. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing I would tell myself is be clear to people that they are free to modify anything I have written here. And I say that in the grand sense, like, if you don't like a rule, throw it out. But more in the sense of, like, if I say there's a well on the table, it doesn't matter whether that's a well or a hole or, a gateway or something. Just replace it and play with what you've got. And the same with, like, the bestiary, because I wrote the bestiary just like, here's a cool list of monsters, never really thinking that people are going to take this book and being like, all right, here's every miniature I need to play. And it was like
I did.
Oh my God, that's totally not what I meant. Like, I really meant just like, if you got some miniatures, here's some rules for them, not here's some rules so you have to get all the miniatures.
Well, you made tables. When you roll on tables are musts, not maze.
Yep. I realize that now. Like, So yeah, be a little more careful about that. And then say, like, here's the table, but it would be better to make your own table based on the miniatures you have, and
or you just roll again until you get a miniature that's in your collection.
Yeah,
it's funny. That's a very interesting. That's a workshop thing where they say roll or pick,
right?
And I think roll or pick, from a balance point of view, is a very interesting way of looking at how you word something in a rule, because that's what we're talking about right now on topic 1. To either go to the fun bus or the Bugatti, right? Roll is fun bus. I want to see what this guy knows, but bam, I'm going to roll a die, and now I get an interesting result, and I'm happy with it because I'm surprised, and I'll forge a narrative in my head up to why my general knows this skill or something like that. But Bugatti guy goes, no, I'm going to read all of these, I'm going to pick the best one, and I'm going to pick that, and that's what I want. And so that might seem like a really simple thing to put in a game, but there's a lot of thought behind roll or pick. Because you're designing a balance feature that's based upon what 2 different types of people playing the game might want, right? Someone might want to be surprised. Someone might want to pick something. And I think roll or pick is one of the smartest bits of game design in a Warhammer publication, probably in the last 10 years, because it again dials into the 3 ways to play. And knowing a lot about that, like, that self-reflection and stuff that the game designers do at workshop, I can tell that's very intentional, because it's in every book now. And I think it dovetails perfectly into that discussion of balance. Is if you're striving for mechanical balance, the pick is the option you want. If you're looking for emotional balance, then the randomness actually becomes a form of balance. The player if we're both doing it randomly, then that's balance, because we didn't get to pick, right?
Yeah.
And it's very simple, but I think, again, if we're talking about that language thing, and being careful with your language as part of balance and the inherent idea of balance, then roll or pick is a great example of what you're talking about, because it would drastically have changed the monster tables in Frostgrave and how people approach them.
I think the last thing, and the thing most directly related to balance, is I would tell myself, players want to see that you as the designer have thought about balance. Whether, so like, Frostgrave First Ed has no system to balance warbands of different levels fighting each other. That's partly because I just didn't think about it at the time, and partly because you have to get really far apart before it's actually an issue. And in fact, that the issue is generally more with, I've got much better soldiers than you've got, then I've got a higher level wizard than you've got. But I did eventually put one in, which helps balance-wise, but it, in and of itself has balance issues. So it's never perfect. But I think by including that in a later supplement, and then by putting that into second edition, it just says to the player, look, I realize that there are potential balance issues here. I have thought about this. This is a way that you can address that, or at least you can attempt to address it. So whether or not players use it, they feel like, okay, it exists. He's thought about it, so it's no longer something I have to worry about, because I think it's less that it came up than people were worried about it, but potentially because they've been burned on it before in games or something. But just knowing that a system existed that they could go to if it ever became a problem made them feel better.
Benevolence, isn't it, in your game design? You're showing care for the experience of the players when you write that in, versus kind of an uncaring, omnipotent game designer in the background who never talks about wanting the game to feel fair, right? By inherently putting that in, you're saying to the players, so new players coming to the table against an experienced Frostgrave warband might feel like they're somewhat outclassed. In order to have them catch up quicker, here's an elastic ability for them to gain a bit more experience by taking on the big dogs and playing a game. And you might lose your first couple games, but here's a free treasure every time you try because you're rewarded for taking them on. And then here's bonus experience for having played against that. And I remove the cap for jumping up 2 levels, whatever it is. It's the acknowledgement that, yeah, this is an imperfect system. And if you come to the table late, you're not going to have as powerful a warband. And so just reading that makes the players go, oh, good, he's played the game.
Yeah.
Right. And then they feel like their experience is something that you care about because you've made that little bit extra effort. And I definitely think in a emotional balance thing, that's a valuable statement, because you don't want a game designer to be silent in judgment. You want a game designer to talk to you when you read a rule book sometimes and talk to you. And even it's funny, even because the big mass market games like Warhammer will have things like a designer's commentary now written into them, where they talk about, here's how we wanted this thing to feel, and here's what we thought when we wrote this or whatever. And that inherently, it can be right or wrong. In practice, it may work out right or wrong, right?
Yeah.
But that's less important to the emotional balance of the game than acknowledging that you're thinking about it and talking about it and sort of like taking the elephant out of the room and putting it up in the air.
Yeah, and it acknowledges that, like, this system is flawed in the sense that it is impossible for it to be perfect. We realize that.
Yeah.
But we're still thinking about it. We're still working on it, and we're all together trying to have fun with it. The more I've been a game designer, like, the more I've come to see all games as kind of living entities, because at least war games, because you can put anything on the table, it can never be fully defined, and thus there's always tinkering to do,
And part of the fun is in the tinkering. There's a whole hobby in, I mean, if you really boil it down, the 5 of us in Blaster, one of our favorite things is thinking about this stuff and discussing it.
Yeah.
Right. And we do that naturally, and we think of it as work because it is work to a great degree. But we would do it before over dinner, and it's the thing that we would just talk about as a group, because that discussion energizes us and is a part of our hobby. And I think that acknowledging that as designers, and that acknowledging that our players sit down and do that too. They're just us at a dinner table, because at some point all of us were players, right? We were just people who enjoyed tabletop games and sat around talking about them. And the only difference between a game designer and a game player is one picked up a pencil, right? And decided to write something down at some point. And that really is the only dividing line. If you want to be a game designer, go start writing games. Someone will play them.
That's the number.
Sorry?
Yeah. That's the number one. That's the difference between the writer and the non-writer, is the writer wrote something.
I think you and I both answered that question at conventions, is how do you become a game designer?
Yeah.
And just ask, well, how many games have you written?
Exactly.
Not a game designer yet. Start designing games. You don't have to ask permission to be a game designer. Just start writing. Yeah. And those are 3, I think, really interesting things that I would have loved to have heard as a game designer, starting off, when I was thinking about, is my game balanced? Is that idea of writing it in a language that creates accessibility, of course, and equal opportunity for people reading it, giving it that that sort of like that tweak where you didn't have any kind of gatekeeping and not having sort of like a random event take away sort of like the feeling of franchise from a certain type of player. My goal really for both the games I've written was to create a narrative experience. I think just like yours. I think if I was to tell myself, I think if I was to tell myself to write Last Days again, which I'm kind of in the process of doing with the game I'm writing now, but it's something totally
Those weren't actually the last days. These are the last days.
The fact that I am writing a third now, and it's drowning out all my other writing endeavors. The things I've learned from writing Last Days and Gamma Wolves definitely boil into the next thing. And I think if I was to give myself that advice, it would be that thing I said earlier when I kind of lit up on the pick or choose is you want your game to try and offer a little bit to everybody, no matter what the experience is. And so if you find yourself writing too many Cracker Jacks, write yourself something where players get to choose every now and again. And the Cracker Jacks thing, of course, is surprises, things that happen randomly in the game. It doesn't hurt to put a clause in there that says pick, right? Because even pick is an appropriate option sometimes based on someone's model collection. You want people to have a good time and have equal opportunity to have a good time. And that feeling of balance, mechanical balance, I try and achieve that by having my systems be simple, by having the internal engine of the car be as simple and streamlined as possible. You know what I mean? Whether it's opposed dice in Gamma Wolves or target numbers in Last Days. It's not, and same with you, opposed D20s. It's not a complicated internal system. You can learn one dice roll and you're done. You don't need 4 pages of wind modifiers like in BattleTech to figure out what your 2d6 roll is going to be. And that again helps with the mechanical players to feel like the game's balanced. But even in the language and stuff, let people do some choosing sometimes. And when I came from the 2009 Last Days to the 2018 Last Days, that was when I started adding things like you could slow down your leveling up rate to nudge the result in a direction you wanted. Because I like the idea of being able to roll for your advances and upgrades. But as soon as it became a totally random character that had skills that weren't applicable to your weapons that you'd modeled it with and stuff like that, I didn't like that result. And someone in the playtest group for Last Day suggested, we'll just have them spend their leftover experiences like might to move the dice roll around. And I was like, that's genius. So you just slow your rate of advance now, and your experience can be used to tweak the dice rolls to get the result you're looking for, or even just closer to it. And also, now you are, when you're rolling the dice for an upgrade, when you decide it's time to level up, if you know you don't have any banked experience to influence the dice roll, then you've accepted the fact that you're getting a random result. So you, again, pick or choose, or pick or roll in that regard.
Yeah,
totally,
I would say
when I wrote that at that point, but having looked back on it for my new stuff, writing a new game right now, that's a big part of my sort of like touchstones, is have people be able to influence the result at a cost, maybe, right? But people who are mechanically designed, they're okay with paying costs because they had a choice in doing it or not. And some of they may end up getting exactly what they want, but if they can pay to do it and tweak it the direction they want to do with their, their experience currency, then go for it. And I think that's a way to creating that feeling of balance in any game, narrative or competitive.
Yeah. I would add, like, kind of, I think you're heading down this way anyway, but like, don't let, well, when you have to choose between logic and fun, choose fun. So like what you were saying there, like I'm working on a Ranger's adventure right now where you can find a lot of stuff. And I've taken to, like, when you find a sword, just putting, like, you can choose if this is a hand weapon or a two-handed weapon. That doesn't make any sense at all, of course, that, like, you just always find the one you want. But the fact is, it's so much more fun because it means you're going to get the one you can actually give to your guy as opposed to one that you might be like,
with it.
That's a really cool sword, but I can't use it. Yeah. So, yeah, especially when you're working on what is essentially a narrative game. The player is there because they are invested in their gang or whatever it is. When you can, let them choose how to build it, like you were giving them the option there. So.
Well, they're going to feel better.
Of course, you give them too much.
Yeah,
you don't want too much freedom in your balance goes.
You definitely want to give them the option. Like they've got a feeling like the result was proportional to the cost or the effort, right? And I think when a game is emotionally balanced, that's a big part of it. Is that you feel when the result happened at the end, you're not feeling you got too much, you're not feeling like you got too little. There's a Goldilocks zone for writing, and you have to hit that level in order to make it, I think, an experience that's engaging. And it's impossible to get right. And then the other thing I would tell myself is don't dwell on it. Come up with a system and stick to it, because your internal system being consistent and you're free to tweak it later on, to me, is more important than anything else, because your players will eventually absorb your internal system. So like when I did Last Days, I wrote a stat line that was like the bare bones 50% of everything stat line, and I made it worth 6 scavenge points. And that was just a random number. I like the number 6. 6 scavenge points. It's different from 5. We've only got X number. We got 100 points to spend at the beginning. 6 is a good round number. And then whenever a stat or a skill went on that template, I added 3 scavenge points to it. So if a guy's got a stat, he's worth 9. If a guy's got a bump in a skill, he's worth 9. He's got 2, he's worth 12. He's got 3, he's worth 15. And I think my players could sort of intuitively see that, because everything was worth multiples of 3. If it was worth worse, it went down to 3, and 3 was the minimum cost for anything. And that created some internal balance right there, because I was able to kind of like consciously absorb it. I knew that once the first game started, it didn't matter anymore what this stuff cost, because people were just randomly showing up to the refuge, finding guns lying around on the ground that were worth tons of scavenge points and giving them to people.
This is useful.
So it was totally irrelevant. So as long as it was mentally, internally balanced for the people looking at it, done. You're off to the races, and you could come up with a system that looks kind of like you put a ton of thought into it. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. As long as a body costs 6, and then you've got X number of arms and legs to stick on bodies, then you're good to go, and you're fine. Because honestly, the bodies were worth more than the skills and stuff were. And so once again, I overvalued probably a guy with 2 stat buffs, because he's worth 2 people, right? Two human bodies are always going to be worth more in Last Days than a guy who's really good at shooting a gun, who's kind of tough or brave. And that's the law of numbers. And so, and same with dumping gear on a thing. And also gear costs for me were very difficult. I had to kind of almost ignore them, except for the outside, because actually more powerful the gun you have in Last Days becomes a liability, because the more times you fire, the more noise you make, the more zombies appear right next to you at the edge of the table, right? So the most offensively powerful warband in Last Days is a trained warband, all carrying like, M249s and M16s, or, like C7s or whatever, running around, shooting everything they can see. But every turn, every guy in the warband is bringing a zombie on the table right next to them if possible. And so like their DZ is getting overrun like 15 minutes into the game. And the guy with like a bow and arrow, that's like, what's going on over there? Those guys are losing their minds, running around stealing those scavenge points and leaving. So it was interesting, because I couldn't overvalue really powerful weapons, because the game inherently had this flex in where there was a gameplay cost to firing your really valuable, cool weapon, in that you were all of a sudden getting jumped by zombies. And zombies are no joke to try and kill, especially at early levels, because they're hard to hit. So don't worry about that stuff too much. Just come up with a template and stick to the template.
I guess I've done that on a kind of, in a very different way. So especially working with like solo scenarios, more with Rangers, but also with Frostgrave, you have this idea of balance, in that you have to balance the scenario versus the player. But of course, there is literally no right answer in that. What is a balanced scenario for a player? Because I can write a scenario in which the player is probably going to walk through. I can write a scenario in which the player is probably going to die horribly. But what is it that you as a player wants? Do you want a game in which probably 50% of your guys are going to die? 90%? 20%? So with Rangers, I've got like, this is what I think, you should probably suffer in an average scenario. The dice are going to vary that quite a bit, but as long as I can kind of stick to that, then at least players know what to expect every time they're playing the game. And I vary it a bit. Some missions are supposed to be a little bit harder than others, but yeah, so as long as I am balanced kind of internally in my thinking, I think that'll translate to the player, and they'll realize that, even if they don't consciously realize it in the same way. I guess with yours, they did consciously see 3 points, but they can see that you are following a system, and that just again makes them feel confident that
Yep, I did that with my solo scenarios in Last Days, because the hard thing with writing solo and cooperative content is, and it's funny because it's hard in the way that you did it, is you took, here's the ranger level I think should be in this scenario, and the scenario always acts like this. I went a different direction with the solo stuff in Last Days, where I said add up all the levels in your group currently, and that many zombies starts in the
right
table. Because that can be a lot of zombies all of a sudden. Like you can have 20 zombies starting on the table, and that's actually a lot to kill. But it meant that it didn't matter what the group was. If they were very weak, then only a few zombies on the table, and it would exponentially get bigger as time went on. And so I didn't have to write a specific threat list really for my scenarios. And when I wrote evolutions, it was the same thing. It was based on how many people made noise and how long the game was going on. So I didn't have to worry about balancing the extra monsters, big monsters showing up, because they would show up based on, again, proportionally how long you spend on the table. And so if you're playing a high level group on the table with more zombies, you're going to make more noise and the game's going to last longer. And so the bigger zombies would show up and fight you. Whereas if you're like this little starving to death sneaky group, you sneak on, get the stuff and get off, hopefully, and are able to grow your group to the point where you do get that big fight later on.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because you've had to almost assign a value for your scenarios, and I went a different direction and said, well, hopefully what happens is as they grow, the scenario grows harder to them. And so my scenarios tend to be narratively less interesting because they're more mechanically operated, and then randomly by the dice where stuff shows up. Whereas yours are more story driven, but you run that risk of, hopefully the right ranger shows up for the scenario so that they don't get stomped by whatever.
Totally.
I've played most of your scenarios now. And you get it right more than you get it wrong for sure. But I've had a few close calls.
Yeah, I mean,
Molly the Halfling really pulled that rolling pin, or everyone was going to die in this scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it is really tough because it's actually tougher in writing Frostgrave ones because the power variation between wizards is so much greater than rangers. Rangers they can probably do this, whereas wizards he may be able to line the table with walls, whereas the next one might just turn invisible.
Using health as your bench line, because of a level 5 or 10 or 20 warband would have X number of health typically, right? So you'd have let's say your ranger's got 20-ish, your each of your companions has 10 to 12, you know what I mean? Your animal companions might have 5.
Yeah.
So at an average companion value, this warband's going to have, let's say, 80 to 100 health. And so when you're creating the monster pool for the scenario, then you could have it be, let's say, 80 health starts on the table and there's 50 in reserve. And that way there is more potentiality for battlefield presence showing up, because that would be, if I was going to eyeball something, I'd eyeball health, because health is the commodity down over the course of the game.
Yeah, I mean, so in Frostgrave, when player versus player anyway, I use level because that's what everybody just intuitively looks at, because it's the number that goes up. And but you're right, health is actually a better measure because, like I said,
and it's funny because you've intrinsically balanced health now in Frostgrave with free 10 health, so everyone's got 100 health to start off with, plus the wizard plus the apprentice. So sorry, actually, it's more than 100 health. It should be 80 health.
Yeah, it's 106 or something like that.
But that does inherently balance the game, because there's 100 or something health to be able to try and fight somebody else's health. And you might end up with slightly more if you've got all knights or whatever. But even with the specialist cap, you basically capped health on either side, and then it comes down to the levels will be the second balancing factor. So you don't have to worry about health in Frostgrave at all anymore. Actually, you just fixed that by basically giving everybody mostly the same. So high five, man! Yeah, you nailed that one. Think about
it only took 5 years to figure it out.
Yeah, well, then the level
5 years of watching Owen destroy it.
Because health is now sorted, right? Whereas in Rangers, that's less the case, because the opposing side has to be the other player that would exist in Frostgrave.
Yeah, and I'm not trying, because Rangers is so much more narrative than Frostgrave.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to balance it in quite the same way. For one thing, so when I wrote Perilous Dark, I actually want the scenarios to be hard. Like,
Yeah.
you can get a total party kill.
Vapor
Yeah,
snakes,
exactly.
Joke. I hate your vapor snakes with a fiery passion of a.
Yeah, that one's too hard. That one I got the balance
You
wrong.
admit it? Oh, he's admitting it. I have on the record. Vapor snakes are too hard.
I admit it. Like, but part of it, it is partly like there are some wizards that are just going to be much better in that scenario than others.
Right.
But that one is just too hard, and they're like that one more than any of the others. I think has a logic puzzle answer, which is basically you have to use guys to draw the snakes off
to draw them away. Yeah,
way.
that's what I do.
But of course, most people don't want to do it. You go over there and die.
That's it. Killian, you need to jump everywhere with leap, and all these snakes are following you from now on. And Paxton's going to pretend he's not a wizard for a long time.
Exactly. But I think that works for Frostgrave because, like, there you're playing it to beat the game. Whereas Rangers, you're playing it to see what happens next. And so I'm deliberately trying not to kill you all in Rangers.
Right.
I want to make it close, but I don't want to do it. Occasionally the dice will do it for me, but that's part of why you play. But it's a very different.
That's an interesting tip too, I think, maybe for all of those rookie designers out there to think about how do you write a scenario, especially in a standard or cooperative game, is you have to think about it in terms of pools of resources. I like health as a pool of resource because I feel like it's immutable because it doesn't have a random thing affecting it.
Right.
The attacks coming at it are going to be random on both sides, so that inherently balances itself. And then in solo game design, I feel like that's the same sort of thing, is that if you can visualize what the asset pool the player has going into it, and then what is the opposing asset pool, try and pick the asset pool that you can count the easiest when you're writing, because then you've at least decided this is the thing I'm going to go by. And when you play through those few scenarios and you see people play through them or you're playtesting them, you'll see what the result is. You can actually have something you can track. Right at the end of the game, when the turns ended or when all the Rangers were alive, what was their resource pool of health, for instance, versus how many of the monsters did they kill? And did I eyeball it right? Was there too much left over? Did they die? Like, can I tweak this number? And that just tells you who to pull and who to push. And that's a thing from when you're trying to balance a game or a scenario. You got to give yourself some kind of KPI, some kind of benchmark that you can look at to say, what felt wrong here? You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be super accurate. I wouldn't get too good at stats and weapon rules and stuff like that. Sometimes you have to do that stuff if you're doing a really combat-oriented game. But like, you need to have something you can eyeball that is a fixed point in space. And health is a good one. Number of models on the table. So activations is a good one too. Like, how many times can you activate and go do something? Because you found that was out of whack with Frostgrave when you could have a huge warband imbalance. And you inherently, again, fix that one by giving out free, just like jobbers, basically, to go and follow the wizard around. Do you have any fixed points in space that you look at when you're trying to balance stuff?
Probably models is the big one. I mean, because models are more, the fact that something is on the table that can roll dice is more valuable than anything else than a model that's not on the table. So
well, the number of times when you're actually, it becomes more valuable.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. But then you have to, for solo gaming especially, you have to factor in that one side has human intelligence, and thus my model that can roll dice is worth more than the model that doesn't have human intelligence. So kind of it needs to be tougher or scarier. There do need to be more of them, to balance the fact that
it's a sponge. It has to be a damage sponge.
I'm going to use a plan,
it doesn't know what to do. It can't make good choices.
Yeah. It's. You are going to use the gang up rules to your advantage. It is not, and things like that. Or you're going to, use the magic you brought from last game. It is not. So, but, if you start with, I've got 10 guys and they've got 10 guys, that's the most important thing, I think.
Yeah.
And then you start.
You can roll 10 dice. They can roll 10 dice.
Yeah. So, and then, but it is such an impossible question that you play it and you see what happens. And, you go, whoa, I was really wrong.
Yep. And then I think my last thing is when you put the game in front of people to try to hunt for balance, make sure that you know their expectation or what type of player is taking the game so that you can appropriately internalize their feedback. right? I know exactly what I'm going to get by giving it to the players that I give it to and the people that I give it to. And I have to work within that confirmation bias or not bias. I know the things that are going to drive them crazy. And sometimes I just have to straight up say no, you know what I mean, in a design choice. Well, you should just do it like this. No. And don't necessarily ask for fixes. You can definitely get way bogged down by having 50 different options of doing something that somebody else is giving you. I would say it's only 1 in 100 times you actually get something you like out of somebody else offering a fix. Typically, you need to go for framing your balance feedback. You're like, what am I looking for? With some very specific questions. Like, how much time did you spend? Like, if I give a thing like Gamma Wolves to Owen, I want to ask him questions like, so how much time did you spend making mechs? And if he goes, oh, that was like my favorite part. I sat there and I made like 4 or 5 different. I tried to like get the one that was the fastest, or you could go and do this. I made one that like didn't even have guns. It just ran around getting objectives. And I made one that did that. You're getting way more interesting feedback about the potential of the rules you've written than, so what'd you think about the game, the mech design? And he goes, oh, I think you should be able to have this gun, or I think this should be worth this many points. I don't care about any of that stuff. I want to know, very specific things like how much fun did you make? How many did you try and build? What did the ones that you build do? And then I'm going to get interesting feedback from that kind of a balance question versus, so what'd you think? And then he'll just go into like all of these little things that his brain got stuck on in the game design that actually don't really matter from like a designer's point of view. From a designer's point of view, it's more top level than that. Yeah, I think that's it. I think those are all the things that I would really, when it comes to balance, I would like meatily suggest to myself back in time. And I'm trying to carry forward into what I do now, because I think that's a sanity coping mechanism for guys like you and me, because we're going to overthink all this stuff. And if I don't have rules in my own head when I design, it can, people go crazy. People can never finish a game because of it. There's a lot of people who want to be a game designer who start writing their game and get so lost in trying to make the perfect balanced game that they lose the point, I think, and they create something that's, what's the term, over-engineered. Yeah, it's the Homer Simpson car. Remember when Herb lets Homer design a car? He over-engineers his car.
Separate pods for the kids.
Yeah, don't make the Homer Simpson car. I'm going to use that as the thumbnail for this video. I'm going to use the Homer Simpson car, because I think that is a true peril in game design, and you've seen a few games go through it in the past. I think that you saw War Machine go through that with their constant, like, it was called the community development, something, CIDs or something, like community integrated development, where like they'd ask the players for fixes and everyone was waiting for the next community development thing before playing a new army. And it became this like, this process of like socially engineering a game and trying to make the perfect war game versus just making the game they wanted. And it's a real, like, there's a real sort of like peril if you don't, as a game designer, have some rules that you stick to, and then accept the fact that it's not going to be for everybody, because it's not for everybody.
I actually just had the first time that I've had the guts to do this, but on the Frostgrave forum, someone asked a question, and I basically just said, the rules do not have an answer to that question. You know, I got nothing for you. The question was, if you move a guy up a stairs 5 inches, has he moved 5 inches or has he moved 7 inches because he's gone too
right, the trig, yeah.
And I was, like, whichever way you want to play it, as long as you and your friend play it that way, I don't care. I don't know, like. Yeah,
because
it hurts my head to think about it.
You than anyone else, and so you decide how it works. I'm not gonna.
I'd never even thought of it. I just put my ruler down. Whoop, 5 inches. Like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But then a lot of people said, nope, it's 7 inches. Oh, all right, okay, but this is not a game, not a rule the book needs to tell you.
Began the 7 inches versus the 5 inches.
And then, exactly. You got, no, take out your trigonometry here, and it's just like, this is where you've started to go wrong.
As soon as Trig entered Frostgrave, Joe left the building.
I'm out of here.
Nope. You just put your hat back on and you left the building. Deuces.
I can add and subtract within 20. That's where I stay.
Well, it's funny too. That's a good piece of advice. If you're ever approaching a game designer with a question, remember that they don't necessarily care about the stuff you care about. And that sounds terrible, and I don't mean it to sound off-putting, but like, they can't approach the game from your point of view. And so you may not get the answer you want because they're not looking for the result or the experience in their design that you were looking for in your question or in your gameplay experience. And so you might get dissatisfying answers from us sometimes. Answers that you hate, and it might lead you to go and write your own miniature war game, and I hope that's what happens.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's
I'm gonna drop.
That's where we all started, isn't it?
Spent, wow, well over an hour talking about balance, which was awesome.
Well,
and so thanks for Joe. I would have comments for this. If you guys have a game design question that you think would be a really good one for me and Joe to talk about the next time he's on, because we're going to go through all the Blaster crew and do these one-on-one, hit me up in the comments and we'll pick one hopefully from your comments to talk about next time. So thanks for being on, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, happy wargaming.
Thanks for tuning in and checking out today's Let's Talk Game Design. Now, if you have ideas for topics that me and the Blaster crew could discuss, put them down in the comments below and let us know what you thought about this episode and any of your thoughts on the topics that we talked about. Big thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for the Let's Talk. Till then, I'm Ash. Happy wargaming.